Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're gonna have a fun video. Hopefully at least we're gonna talk about the purpose of orchid medium and why we use it. Pretty often I get comments from you guys asking me if you can grow orchids in this way or in that way, is it suitable and so on, and really things boil down to a few golden rules. At least in my opinion. So today we're just gonna touch base with those rules, and hopefully by the end of this video you can make the decision yourself, knowing a few extra things about orchids. So to better understand the purpose of the medium and what medium is actually suited for orchids, we will split this video in three categories. One is terminology and definitions, so we have a better understanding what articles mean when they say what they say and why they classify orchids like they do. The second is theory. We will think about how orchids naturally grow and put ourselves a little bit in their shoes and see what we might experience naturally, at least in the way related to the subject. And third, practice, how we actually apply the terminology and theory to practicing growing orchids. So with this in mind, let's get to work. Alrighty, the most common term you will find in articles which describe orchids is epiphyte. Most of the orchids we can grow at home are actually epiphytes. So let's see what an epiphyte is. If we take a look at the definition, we learn that an epiphyte is a plant who grows harmlessly upon another plant, and it obtains moisture and nutrients from the air, rain, and whatever debris accumulate around it. Epiphyte orchids include the famous Phalaenopsis orchid, but not only. Dendrobiums, Cattleyas, Oncidium, Miltoniopsis. Pretty much 90% of the orchids we can find in stores or flower shops. Another term we might find in articles is terrestrial. So let's see the definition. A terrestrial plant is one that grows on or in or from the land. The vast majority of plants are terrestrial actually, but in the orchid world there are a few which are terrestrial or even semi-terrestrial, meaning they don't necessarily grow in thick soil, but they don't grow in the air either. Cymbidiums, Zygopetalums, and Paphiopedilum orchids can be terrestrial or semi-terrestrial, but other than those there aren't many common orchids which are terrestrial or semi-terrestrial. One more term that we might find in articles is lithophyte. And lithophytes are plants that grow in or on rocks. They are in a way a bit similar to epiphytic orchids in the sense that they don't grow in soils, they can have aerial roots, they can grow attached to the rocks like other orchids might grow attached to trees, but they can also have maybe a little bit of soil or maybe other type of vegetation around them. And in our collections there are a few lithophyte orchids. Some Phragmipediums are lithophytes, even some Paphiopedilums. The Dendrobium kingianum can be a lithophyte, and some orchid species are both epiphytes and lithophytes in the sense that in some regions they can grow on trees while in other regions more on rocks. So these are the three main terms we might find in articles when they describe orchids, but I will add two more terms that we don't normally find, but I hear people refer to them. Here and there you can hear these terms in relation to orchids. Doesn't make them correct. So the first term is parasitic. So let's see what is a parasitic plant. It is one that derives some or all of its nutritional requirements from another living plant. And thinking of the word parasite, it's easy to understand what this term refers to. A parasitic plant lives on another living creature, and it sucks nutrients from that living plant. Needless to say, the host is harmed by parasitic plants. Reading the articles, you will notice that orchids, or at least the orchids we can grow in the house, are not parasitic plants, in the sense that even if they grow on trees, they don't extract sap or other nutrients from the tree itself, and they don't harm the tree. Okay, and the last term we will define is saprophyte. Now this is something I didn't hear very often, but there is one video on YouTube which calls Phalaenopsis orchids saprophytes. So let's see what a saprophyte is. A saprophyte is an organism which gets its energy from dead and decaying organic matter. Fungi or bacteria can actually be saprophytes, which means they feed directly from the dead piece of organic material. Many of them actually produce digestive enzymes to help them obtain the nutrients. So many saprophytes are actually involved in the decomposition process. Alrighty, so now that we are more acquainted with the terms we might find in articles, let's get to the theoretical part and think a little bit about how orchids grow. So let's take epiphytic orchids, the majority of our orchids. Usually they grow on tree trunks and branches. They attach their roots to the bark of the tree. So how would life be for them from the point of view of the actual medium they grow in? Well, first of all, they will get an abundance of air because they don't grow in soil. A tree branch or a tree trunk is exposed constantly with air movement and with very little constraining factors that would diminish the air quantity. Most of the times, water would be provided by rainfall, which can be more or less abundant. Also, the period in which it rains might be longer or shorter. But rain is not the only source of water orchids might encounter. They can also encounter dew. And dew as well can form in greater quantities or less quantities. It can form every day or seasonal, depends on the orchid and her location. So if we think about it, orchids get two things constantly. One is air, they're up in the trees and not in the soil. And the second one is regular water through rain or dew or relative humidity even. Leaving aside nutrients and other factors or microorganisms, the two major things that are constant in an orchid's environment are air and water and this ratio between them. So now that we know the theory about air and moisture and this ratio that is ever present in an orchid's environment, we need to apply it into practice. Now, practice is actually the fun part, and knowing the terminology and the theory will explain why we have so many different mediums and so many types of setups for our orchids, how we grow them in so many different ways, all very successful. Because in the end, no matter what type of medium you're using, no matter what type of setup, either mounted, bare-rooted or potted, everything boils down to one single golden rule: air and water ratio. It is the most important factor to consider when choosing medium or a setup for your orchid. So to explain why this is the most important and crucial aspect, let's go back to terminology and let's get the order in reverse. Should we care if the medium we use is organic or inorganic? Well, the answer is no, and this is because orchids are not saprophytes, meaning they do not digest directly the medium in which they grow in. They depend on other organisms to provide decomposition and also provide nutrients, which just so happens we find in fertilizer bottles. Also, should we care if the medium we are growing our orchids in is alive or dead? Well, yet again, no, because orchids are not parasitic, and as we discussed, parasitic plants only thrive on live plants. The only three terms that actually matter are epiphytic, terrestrial, and litophyte, and all of them have in common a ratio between air and water. The most common medium you will find on the market are bark chips. Now, you would say this is very similar to how orchids would grow in nature. Well, I wouldn't go as far, simply because this bark is not alive, it's dead. It is subjected to decomposition processes, and since orchids do not feed on the bark itself, this medium needs to be changed periodically. So why do we use bark chips? Well, it's pretty simple. It offers air. Because the bark is chunky and it's not very water retentive, it also holds air pockets, which are crucial for orchid roots. But it does retain just a little bit of water, enough for the orchids to absorb what they need, given if you water correctly. It is also a non-toxic material, so we won't have any weird substances that will burn or affect the roots. And it also has some smooth surfaces, so the roots don't get poked while they grow. Therefore, the bark chips is a pretty cheap and quite appropriate medium to grow our orchids in. Another common medium in which you will find orchids is dried sphagnum moss. Yet again, we are dealing with a dead piece of material, but that doesn't really matter as long as we refresh it periodically. It is an organic substance, just like bark chips, but again, that doesn't really matter for us. What matters is that sphagnum moss can retain quite a lot of water. And if it's not very packed into the pot, it can also retain air pockets. Sphagnum moss happens to be quite the fluffy medium, so if potted correctly, orchids can certainly do very well only potted in sphagnum moss. A more uncommon medium in which you will find orchids is clay medium. When you purchase orchids, most probably they will not be potted in clay, but if you visit forums and see what other people are using in the orchid hobby, you will pretty much find a lot of people using clay in the form of leca, the round beads you see, or ceramis in my case, which again is made out of clay, but it has different properties. So this medium is inorganic. Does it really matter? No, because they're not saprophytes. And also this medium is not alive. Does it matter? No, because they're not parasites. What matters is that this medium can retain water, but it also retains air pockets. As you can see, it is quite the chunky medium. The difference between inorganic medium and organic medium is that this one does not decompose and it doesn't need to be changed periodically. Another common way in which you will find orchids being grown is mounted on a piece of cork or a slab. It can be organic, such as wood, or inorganic, such as clay. The orchid is actually simply tied to this piece of wood and it grows on it. So again, do we care that this is organic or inorganic or it's dead? Not really, but what we care about is the quantity of air this type of fixture can give. What it doesn't really give is moisture. But we can handle moisture simply by watering this orchid or ensuring that it actually gets humidity. And these are just a few types of mediums or setup. You will most likely find other types of medium that are not widely used, but some people use successfully. So as you can see, we can grow orchids in many different ways, simply because all we are interested in is the air and moisture ratio. And additionally, we are interested that the medium or support we're using is not toxic, obviously. It doesn't leach out salts, it doesn't alter pH, and it's also not spiky that it can damage orchid roots. Other than that though, there is no limitation when it comes to orchid medium. So you might now wonder, if all of these mediums are just so good for orchids, why some people cannot grow orchids in, let's say, sphagnum moss, or some cannot grow orchids mounted, or do better in a different medium or a different type of setup, and even go as far as to say that orchids should only be grown in a certain way. Well, it all depends on the person who's growing their orchids, what they have around them, their environment, their lifestyle, and so on, because all of these materials have some additional properties. So for example, a mounted orchid. This is the closest to nature setup in which you can grow your orchid. Why doesn't this work for everybody? Well, it's quite simple. Remember, I was telling you in the theory part of this video that in nature it might rain for an hour, or you might have dew in the morning or pretty high humidity. Well, in a home it doesn't really rain, and you also don't have dew, which means a mounted orchid requires us to provide that rain and water on a daily basis. And how we provide the water is important too. If in nature it can rain for an hour, the roots can get saturated within that hour. But in our home, if we just spray it, the water might evaporate in 5 minutes, time in which the roots cannot absorb the quantity they need. So in practice, watering a mounted orchid can be quite difficult for a home grower. But for a person who grows orchids in an automated greenhouse, or a person who has the possibility and time to hose down all of the orchids once a day or a few times a day, this is the ideal growing style. So you can see how two different persons can find this growing technique perfect or really not suited. Also, very water retentive materials such as sphagnum moss might be very good for somebody living in a dry environment or a hot environment, but detrimental for somebody living in a cold or humid environment. Even though this medium is good for orchids, we need to associate it with the climate and environment in which we grow our orchids. And this applies to all the mediums and all the setups we can grow our orchids in. They need to be in accordance with our environment. Some of us can use a mixture between the bark and the sphagnum moss to get that air and water ratio right. Others only need the moss, or others can do very well with only bark. Same with inorganic medium. Some of us use semi-hydroponics, which constantly stay moist, while others use a combination of styles between traditional potting and semi-hydroponics because of our climate, our colder temperatures, and our high humidity. So in the end, the purpose of orchid medium is not to feed them in any way. Its sole purpose is to help us provide the correct air and water ratio. But my opinion is that the medium we are using doesn't matter quite at all if it follows 3 simple rules. 1. Air and water ratio. 2. It is not toxic, and here I will include leaching out salts, altering pH, and things that can disrupt good root activity. And also, it is not pokey or can physically damage orchid roots in any way, because I don't really think orchids can grow on needles. So from here, it is up for you to decide, it is up for you to research, and why not even test out and see what works better for you. There is one more thing that might be related to this, but it's a totally different discussion, which I intend to do in the future. There is the aspect of roots trying to anchor the orchid and clinging to stuff, therefore making the orchid more stable and feeling more safe in its location. That's a more elaborate discussion, and it refers to hanging orchids kept bare roots versus orchids which are mounted or potted, in which surfaces are available, and the difference between them. So in another fun video, we'll talk about that as well. So okay, thank you guys for watching. Hope you found this interesting. Let me know down below what type of medium you're using, if you're using something that we've never heard of. do let us know down below. The more variety, the better. So if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for daily orchids and plants videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye! Finally, the Reine Marquez is starting to shed her flowers. She's been in bloom for 2.5 months already, which is quite a long time, I have to say. So there we go, she really does have long-lasting flowers. Well, maybe not Phalaenopsis long-lasting, but good enough.